The alien princess was promised to a prince. Then the human engineer fixed her broken heart. The betrothal contract was 43 pages long, and Selythe had read every word of it twice, the way she read everything that mattered. Carefully, and with the particular dread of someone hoping to find an escape clause that did not exist. It did not exist. The Velrenna Unification Accord, drafted by men who had never once asked her opinion on the matter, was airtight in the way that only documents written by people who will never have to live inside them tend to be. Page 11 specified the date. Page 12 specified the venue, the Hall of Standing Light, chosen for its acoustics and its symbolism, neither of which Selythe cared about even slightly. Page 13 specified, in language so dry it could have started a fire, that the union between Princess Selythe of House Velrenna and Prince Dalen of the Korthic Dominion would secure trade corridors, mineral rights, and 70 years of uneasy peace between two governments that had spent most of a century lobbing increasingly polite insults at each other across a shared border. She had signed it on a morning so ordinary that she remembered the weather more clearly than the signing itself. A thin gray drizzle over the eastern towers, the kind that made the whole city look like it was being viewed through old glass. Her mother had stood beside her with a hand on her shoulder, not for comfort, Selythe suspected, but to keep her upright. Her father had not attended. Kings did not attend the parts of statecraft that required pretending their daughters had agency in the decision. 3 months later, the drizzle had become a memory, and the wedding had become a season. The palace had organized itself entirely around the date now, the way a tide organizes itself around a moon it never sees and cannot argue with. Tailors arrived weekly with bolts of fabric, the color of Korthic mourning rites turned inside out into celebration, because apparently that was a thing the two cultures had agreed counted as compromise. Selythe stood through fittings with her arms raised like a woman, surrendering to an invisible army, while attendants murmured measurements to each other in the clipped, efficient tone of people discussing livestock. She had stopped flinching at the pins weeks ago. She had not stopped flinching, internally, at the date circled in red on every calendar in the palace, a date that approached with the patient, unhurried confidence of something that knew it didn't need to rush, because she had nowhere else to be. The strange thing, the thing she turned over at night, lying very still so she wouldn't wake the attendant sleeping in the antechamber, a courtesy surveillance arrangement nobody called by its honest name, was that she didn't hate Dalen. Hating him would have been almost a comfort, would have given the whole arrangement the clean shape of tragedy. But Dalen, when she'd met him twice now across a long table flanked by advisors taking notes on every word either of them said, had been perfectly pleasant. Mild, courteous in the way of a man reading from a card. He'd complimented her ears actually in their first meeting, said something about how the Velrenna bloodline's tapered ears were considered elegant even on the Dominion side of the border, an old compliment dressed up as a new one, and she had smiled and said thank you and felt, in that moment and every moment since, absolutely nothing. Not revulsion, not anger, just a vast, quiet, climate-controlled nothing like standing in a room where someone had turned off all the furniture. That, she decided, was the actual tragedy, not cruelty. Just absence, dressed in good tailoring, smiling back at her from across 43 pages of legal language. So she did what royal women had apparently done for generations before her. She got extremely good at being busy. She filled her calendar with rehearsals and correspondence and ceremonial obligations she'd previously delegated, because an empty hour was an hour in which she might have to feel something, and feeling something had become, lately, a luxury she could no longer reliably afford. Her chambers, usually her one refuge, a sprawling set of rooms on the palace's eastern wing with windows that looked out over the terrace gardens, had become merely another stage, attendants drifting in and out with garment bags and floral arrangements and the occasional Korthic diplomat, just stopping by to admire the view and not coincidentally report back on her demeanor. It was in this state of low-grade, exhausted siege that the climate control system in her chambers chose, with spectacular bad timing, to die. It happened during a dinner she was hosting for 3 visiting Korthic ministers, a dinner intended to demonstrate warmth and hospitality and general enthusiasm for the impending unification of 2 great houses. The system gave a soft mechanical groan, like something apologizing in advance, and then the temperature in the room dropped roughly 12 degrees in the space of 90 seconds. One of the ministers, mid-sentence about trade tariffs, simply stopped talking and watched his own breath fog in front of him with the slow horror of a man witnessing an omen. "It does this sometimes," Selythe said, with the brittle cheer of someone who has decided that acknowledging the disaster calmly is preferable to acknowledging it while crying. "Old building. Character." "Character," the minister repeated, pulling his ceremonial sash tighter around himself like a blanket. By the next morning, the system had overcorrected violently in the other direction, turning her sitting room into something approximating a greenhouse. And the steward, a long-suffering man named Orville, who Selythe was fairly sure had aged a full decade since the engagement was announced, informed her, with the weariness of a man who had personally filed 11 maintenance requests and received 11 shrugs, that the palace's usual technicians had declared the unit beyond local expertise, and that, in a development nobody had seen coming, they were bringing in an outside contractor, a human one, from the trade mission that had set up in the lower city 8 months prior, mostly engineers and diplomats trying to negotiate import rights for off-world machine parts that nobody on Velrenna quite trusted yet. "A human," Selythe repeated, mostly to make sure she'd heard correctly. "Apparently their engineering corps has some experience with this particular model of unit," Orville said, consulting a data slate with the air of a man reading a sentence he didn't fully believe himself. "It was manufactured off-world before the trade routes shifted. He's meant to arrive within the hour, Your Highness, if that's agreeable." It was, Selythe thought, about as agreeable as anything else currently happening to her, which was to say she had no particular say in it, and had stopped pretending otherwise weeks ago. "Fine," she said, "tell him not to freeze any more ministers." Orville, to his credit, did not ask her to clarify. The human arrived precisely 58 minutes later, toolkit slung over one shoulder, hair slightly damp from what she would later learn was a frantic dash through an unexpected rainstorm 2 streets over. And he walked into her sitting room with the confident stride of a man who had clearly been told where to go and had, just as clearly, misjudged the height of the doorframe, because he caught the top of it with his shoulder hard enough to stagger half a step sideways and very nearly send his toolkit clattering across the floor. Sorry, that door's shorter than it looks," he said, to no one in particular, rubbing his shoulder while glancing around the room for whoever might be in charge. Selythe, seated by the window with a book she hadn't actually been reading, looked up, and for the first time in 3 months felt something that wasn't dread exactly, but was at least its much more interesting cousin, curiosity. "It's the same height as every other door in the palace," she said. He turned toward her voice, registered visibly, in real time, that the woman lounging by the window was in fact the princess he'd been sent to assist, and made a valiant, half-completed attempt at a formal bow that ended somewhere between a bow and a man checking his own shoe. "Right," he said, "of course it is. I'll just the units over here, is it?" "It's the large metal box making the room either an icebox or a sauna depending on its mood," Selythe said. "I assumed that was self-evident even to off-world engineers." He blinked and then, to her genuine surprise, laughed, a short, real sound, nothing like the careful diplomatic chuckles she'd been fielding for months. "Fair," he said. "I'm Ethan, by the way. Probably should have led with that instead of the door." "Selythe," she said, and watched him set down his toolkit and crouch in front of the offending unit like a man approaching a wild animal he respected, but did not entirely trust, and found, with some alarm, that she was still watching him a full minute after she should have gone back to her book. Ethan, it turned out, Talk to machinery the way some people talk to pets, low, conversational, slightly accusatory. And Selythe discovered this within the first 10 minutes of his visit, when he popped the front panel off the climate unit, peered into its tangled guts, and said, with real feeling, "Oh, you absolute disaster. What did they do to you?" "Are you addressing the appliance?" Selythe asked, "or me?" "The appliance, for now." He pulled a small diagnostic scanner from his toolkit, waved it over the exposed wiring, and frowned at whatever readout only he could see. "This thing's a Haas-Calder unit, off-world manufacture, must be, 15 years old. Your local techs wouldn't have touched this with a 10-foot pole. It runs on a regulatory protocol that got phased out before half of them were even trained." He glanced up at her, and there was something almost apologetic in it. "Good news is, I actually know this model. Bad news is, the part that's failing isn't something I can fix in an afternoon. I can stabilize it, buy you time. But it's going to need a proper replacement eventually. And that part isn't exactly sitting on a shelf in your lower city." "How encouraging," Selythe said. "So you're telling me my chambers will continue to alternate between the two extremes of human discomfort?" "I'm telling you I can make the swings less dramatic," he said. "Think of me less as a miracle worker and more as a man buying you slightly better weather." She found herself almost smiling at that, which she noted with some private alarm, the way one notices a small, unfamiliar ache and pokes at it to see if it's serious. "A modest ambition." "I specialize in modest ambitions," Ethan said, already elbow-deep in the wiring again. "Ask anyone. It's on my business cards. Well, it would be if I had business cards. We didn't really plan for Royal Palace House calls when I signed up for this trade mission." "What did you plan for?" "Honestly, mostly arguing with customs officials about whether a thermal regulator counts as a weapon." He said it without looking up, in the same easy tone he'd used to discuss the weather, and Selythe felt the oddest little jolt at how unguarded it was, no performance in it, no awareness of an audience that needed managing. Every conversation she'd had in months had been, in some fashion, a performance. This was just a man complaining about paperwork. "Does it," she asked, "count as a weapon?" "Depends who you ask. Depends what you pointed at, frankly." He pulled a length of corroded cable free with a small grunt of effort and held it up for her inspection like a hunter displaying a particularly disappointing trophy. "This, for instance, is not a weapon. This is just sad. Look at it. It's given up. You speak about wiring the way other people speak about pets that have stopped eating." "Wiring has feelings too," Ethan said gravely. "This one's feeling betrayed. Probably by whoever installed it, and then never once thought about it again for 15 years. He set the dead cable aside and began rummaging through a case of replacement parts with the focused efficiency of a man who had clearly done this exact motion 1,000 times on 1,000 other broken things. And Selythe, who had intended to return to her book the moment he arrived, and had instead set it face down on her lap and forgotten it entirely, asked the question before she'd quite decided to ask it. "Do you miss it, wherever you're from?" He paused just slightly, hands still inside the machine. "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly the gravity. Yours is close enough that I don't notice most days, but every so often I'll jump for something and overshoot, and for about half a second I feel like an idiot in front of the whole planet." He glanced sideways at her. "You'd think after 8 months I'd have it figured out. I have not figured it out." "I find that strangely comforting," Selythe said, "that even off-world people are still tripping over their own feet." "That universal constant," Ethan said. "Gravity, entropy, and men embarrassing themselves in doorways. Holds true on every planet I've been to, and I've been to 4, so that's practically a peer-reviewed sample size." She laughed, actually laughed. A startled, unrehearsed sound that surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him, his head turning toward her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between pleased and faintly stunned, as though he'd reached into the machine expecting another dead cable and pulled out something alive instead. She cleared her throat and reached for her book, mostly as a way of giving her hand something to do that wasn't betraying how unfamiliar that laugh had felt in her own chest. How long it had been since something had escaped her that hadn't first been filtered through the question of who might be listening, and what they might report. "You have a very good laugh, by the way," Ethan said, returning his attention to the wiring with what might have been deliberate casualness. "Statistically rare commodity around here, in my professional opinion." "And what precisely qualifies you to assess the laughter statistics of an entire palace?" "8 months of fixing things in increasingly important rooms," he said. "You'd be amazed what people say in front of the guy under the floor panel. Mostly nobody laughs. Mostly everybody's very tired and very careful." He said it lightly, but something in it landed with more weight than the tone suggested, and Selythe found herself looking at the back of his head, damp hair, plain workman's jacket, a man who clearly had no idea he just described her entire life back to her in a single sentence, with an attention she hadn't given anyone in this palace in months. "You're very perceptive for a man who walked into a door frame," she said, mostly to deflect. "I contain multitudes," Ethan agreed. "Mostly bruises currently, but multitudes nonetheless." He worked for another 40 minutes, narrating his progress in a steady stream of half-jokes and muttered technical asides. Apparently the unit's primary regulator was, in his professional assessment, having an emotional crisis. And the secondary coil was doing its best, bless it, but its best isn't great. And Selythe found that the time passed differently than it had in months, not the grinding watchpot crawl of every ceremonial hour leading toward the wedding, but something looser, something that didn't feel like waiting for anything at all. When he finally sealed the panel shut, and the room's temperature settled into something blessedly, boringly normal, she felt an odd little drop of disappointment that she immediately, firmly, told herself not to examine. "That should hold for a week, maybe 2, Ethan said, packing his tools with the brisk satisfaction of a job at least temporarily done. "I'll need to come back before it fails again, assuming the palace doesn't find some less door-frame hazardous human to send instead." "I'll specify in the request that they send the same one," Selythe said, before she'd entirely decided to say it, and then immediately busied herself straightening a stack of papers on the table beside her, as though that explained the sentence away. If Ethan noticed anything strange in it, he had the grace, or the sense, not to show it, just nodded and slung his toolkit over his shoulder. "I'd appreciate that. I'm building quite the reputation as the guy who almost concusses himself in royal doorways. Bit of continuity would help." "Mind the frame on your way out," she said. "Already bracing for it," he said, and ducked low enough this time to clear it cleanly, throwing her a quick grin over his shoulder before the door closed behind him. And Selythe sat alone in her newly temperate room for a long moment afterward, listening to the quiet hum of a machine that had, against all odds, been gently and competently repaired, and feeling something in her own chest that she did not yet have a name for, only the faint, unfamiliar suspicion that it had not been broken until just now that she'd noticed someone trying, almost by accident, to fix it. The unit failed again 9 days later, which Selythe noted with an interest she made absolutely no effort to interrogate, and which Orville, bless his weary heart, attributed entirely to off-world manufacturing standards, and not at all to the fact that she may or may not have asked one of the junior technicians, the day before, exactly how long the previous repair was supposed to last, and whether anyone had checked on it recently. Ethan arrived within the hour again, this time clearing the doorframe with the smug precision of a man who had clearly been thinking about that doorframe for 9 days, and announced, before he'd even set his toolkit down, "I want it on record that I ducked. Properly, with intention." "Noted," Selythe said. "Should I have it engraved somewhere?" "A small plaque would suffice. Here a man did not hit his head. Very dignified." He got to work on the panel again, and this time she didn't pretend to read her book at all, just sat across the room with her arms folded and watched him work, which he seemed to find either flattering or alarming, judging by the faint, uncertain glance he kept throwing her way between adjustments. "You're staring," he said eventually, not looking up. "Is this a royal custom I should know about? Supervised repairs? Am I being evaluated?" "You are being supervised," Selythe said. "Possibly evaluated. The jury's still deliberating." Tough crowd. He pulled the same length of secondary coil he'd flagged last time, examined it, and made a small noise of disapproval. "Yeah, this is worse than I thought. Whoever built this unit really did not plan for it to outlive the empire that manufactured it." "Is that a professional diagnosis?" "It's a professional vibe," Ethan said. "I'll have actual diagnostics in a minute, but my gut's usually right about these things. Sort of like a doctor, except instead of a stethoscope I have a multi-tool and a deep, abiding grudge against whoever wrote this unit's maintenance manual. In 3 languages, none of which translate the technical terms correctly, which is its own special kind of nightmare." "You read the maintenance manual in 3 languages." "I read the maintenance manual in 3 languages badly," he corrected. "There's a difference. One version told me, and I'm quoting here loosely because the translation software wasn't great, to soothe the regulator with patience. I don't know what that means. I've tried being patient with it. It doesn't seem to care." Selythe laughed again, easier this time, less startled, as though some part of her had already started expecting that this room, during these hours, was a place where laughing was allowed, and found him watching her when she looked over, an expression on his face that he smoothed away a half-second too late to disguise it entirely. "What?" she said. "Nothing. You laugh like someone who doesn't get to very often." He said it carefully, like a man setting down something fragile, watching to see if it would break. "I don't mean that as, I don't know, an insult or a diagnosis, just an observation." She considered deflecting it, the way she'd deflected everything else for months, with a joke or a change of subject or the practiced, polished nothing she gave Korthic ministers and Velrenna courtiers alike. But the room was warm now, properly warm, his fault and his fix both, and something about the particular quality of his attention, not strategic, not performing concern for an audience of advisors, made the deflection feel unnecessary, almost rude, like declining a gift offered without strings. "I don't," she said, "get to very often. There's a wedding in 4 months, have you heard?" "I've heard rumblings," Ethan said dryly. "Something about a prince and a cord, several hundred pages of legal language, and enough fabric to outfit a small army. Word travels, even down to the lower city. It's everything you've heard and somehow simultaneously less interesting than it sounds." She drew her knees up onto the window seat, an unroyal posture she would never have permitted herself in front of literally anyone else currently employed by this palace. "Dalen is perfectly pleasant. That's the worst part, honestly. If he were cruel, I could at least be furious about something. Instead, he's just fine. Polite. We sat across a table for 2 hours last month discussing irrigation rights, and he complimented my ears, and I smiled and said thank you and felt absolutely nothing, the entire time, like I was watching the conversation happen to someone else." Ethan had gone quiet, his hands still on the panel but not really working anymore, just listening in the specific way she'd noticed he did things, fully, without the half-distracted performance of listening that courtiers did while actually composing their next political maneuver. "That sounds lonely," he said finally. "Being engaged to someone and feeling like you're watching it through glass. It's not supposed to be lonely. It's supposed to be statecraft. Statecraft doesn't get to be lonely, it gets to be effective." She heard the brittleness creep back into her own voice and hated it. Hated that even here, in this room that had started to feel like the one place exempt from the performance kept trying to reassert itself. "Everyone keeps telling me how lucky I am. The alliance is excellent. The timing is excellent. Dalen is, by every reasonable measure, an excellent match." "Sounds like a lot of excellent," Ethan said carefully, "and not a lot of anything else." "That's rather the point of an arranged marriage." "Sure, I get that genuinely. I'm not trying to fix your geopolitics, I promise. That's well above my pay grade and also not remotely my business. He set down the tool in his hand and looked at her properly. The first time all afternoon he'd given the machine less attention than he was giving her. I just think it's allowed to also be a little sad. The excellent thing and the sad thing aren't mutually exclusive. You can have a treaty that's brilliant for two governments and still be allowed to feel like something in you went quiet when you signed it. Selythe found, to her genuine irritation, that her eyes had gone unexpectedly hot, and she looked hard out the window at the gardens below until the feeling passed, because she had not cried about any of this, not once. Not during the signing or the fittings or any of the 100 small ceremonies that had marched her steadily toward a future she'd never once been asked if she wanted. And she was not about to start now. In front of a man whose primary qualification for being in this room was knowing how to fix a 15-year-old climate regulator. "I don't need fixing," she said, more sharply than she meant to. "Didn't say you did," Ethan said gently, no offense in it at all. "I fix machines. I wouldn't know the first thing about fixing a person, and frankly I think anyone who claims they do is probably overselling themselves. I just think people are allowed to say out loud when something's gone quiet in them. That's not the same thing as asking someone to fix it. Sometimes it's just nice to say it to someone who isn't going to write a report about it afterward." She turned back to him, and the directness of his gaze, no agenda behind it, no calculation, none of the watchful triangulation she'd grown so used to reading in every other set of eyes in this palace, undid something in her chest that she'd been holding very carefully shut for months. "It went quiet a long time before the wedding," she heard herself say. "I don't think anyone noticed. I'm not sure anyone was meant to." "I noticed," Ethan said simply, "for what it's worth. Which I realize, from the guy who fixes your air conditioning, might not be worth a great deal." "It's worth more than you think," Selythe said, and watched him absorb that, watched something shift fractionally in his expression, surprise, maybe, or the particular caution of a man realizing he'd wandered further into something than he'd intended. Before he cleared his throat, looked back at the open panel, and said with a visible, almost grateful effort at lightness, "Well, in that case, I should probably actually finish fixing the air conditioning before the jury reconvenes and decides I've been talking instead of working." "The jury is lenient today," Selythe said, and was startled to find she meant it, startled at how much lighter the room felt, how much less like a cage, for the simple, unglamorous fact of one human engineer sitting on her floor with his sleeves rolled up, telling her that the quiet places in her were allowed to be spoken aloud. By the time the climate unit failed a third time, neither of them bothered pretending it was purely mechanical. Ethan arrived, ducked the doorframe with theatrical care, and said, "I'm starting to think this thing only breaks when it senses I haven't visited in a while. Possibly it's lonely, possibly it's matchmaking. I refuse to speculate further." "It's an appliance," Selythe said. "It doesn't have motives." "That's exactly what a sentient appliance would want me to think." But the joke landed thinner than usual, because they both knew the wedding was 6 weeks away now, close enough that the palace had stopped speaking of it in the future tense and started speaking of it, the way people speak of weather already visible on the horizon, not if asterisk, but when asterisk, and how much time remained to prepare for it. The fittings had become final fittings. The correspondence had become logistics. And Selythe, who had spent 2 months discovering, with a kind of helpless wonder, what it felt like to have a single hour in her day that belonged entirely to herself, and to a man who asked nothing of her except honesty, had finally run out of road to avoid the obvious question. She watched him work in silence for a while, the comfortable kind, before she said, "I have to tell you something, and I need you to actually let me finish before you start making jokes to get out of hearing it." Ethan set down his tool with the particular stillness of a man who has been quietly dreading a sentence for several weeks and has just heard its opening line. "Okay," he said. "No jokes. I'm capable of that, occasionally. I think I've fallen for you, Selythe said plainly, because plainness seemed the only honest currency left between them. I didn't intend to. I want to be clear that I didn't go looking for this, the way I don't think you went looking to provide it. But somewhere between the first ruined dinner and this exact moment, something in me that had gone very quiet started. She gestured vaguely, as if the right word might be hovering somewhere near the ceiling. Humming again. And it started because of you. I don't know what to do with that 6 weeks before I marry someone else. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual loose humor in it, just something careful and a little raw. I never meant to interfere with any of this. I want you to know that. I've replayed every conversation we've had at least a dozen times trying to figure out where I crossed some line I shouldn't have. And the honest answer is I don't think I did exactly. I just couldn't watch you go quiet in that particular way, week after week, and not try to ease it. I told myself I was just being a decent person. I'm not entirely sure anymore that's all it was. He looked at her directly. But I also never once thought I was offering you an alternative to the wedding. I'm an engineer on a trade visa. I fix air conditioners for a living. Whatever this is between us, it was never going to be a rescue, Selythe. I don't have a kingdom. I don't have an accord. I have a toolkit and bad jokes, and 8 months of being mildly confused by your planet's gravity. I'm not asking you to rescue me, Selythe said. I think I'm past the point of needing rescuing. I think what you actually did was worse. In a way, you didn't offer me an escape. You just showed me what feeling something again was like. And now I have to go back into a marriage knowing the difference, instead of numb to it the way I was before. That's a much harder thing to live with than a rescue would have been. So what do you want to do with it? I think, Selythe said slowly, working it out as she said it, the way she'd learned to do in this room and only this room, that I want to stop pretending the only 2 options are a loveless marriage or no marriage at all. There's a third option nobody's bothered offering me. Because nobody's bothered asking what I actually want from this alliance beyond my own absence in it. She requested an audience with Dalen the following afternoon, which startled the household enough that Orville personally supervised the tea service, hovering with the anxious energy of a man certain that whatever was about to happen would end with him filing an incident report. Dalen arrived precisely on time, as he always did, and sat across from her with the same mild, courteous patience he brought to every interaction. And Selythe found, looking at him now, that she finally had the vocabulary to name what had always sat strangely between them. I don't love you, she said, without preamble. I want to say that plainly, because I think we've both been too polite to say it for 3 months, and I think the politeness has been doing more harm than the honesty would. Dalen's eyebrows rose very slightly, the most expression she'd seen cross his face in their entire acquaintance. That's remarkably direct, he said. I appreciate it, actually. I don't love you either, if it helps. I've been rehearsing several diplomatic ways to say that for weeks, and you've rather beaten me to it. It helps enormously. Selythe allowed herself, for the first time in this entire arrangement, something like a real laugh, not at him, exactly, but at the sheer, absurd relief of 2 people who'd spent months performing affection neither of them felt, finally setting the performance down at the same table. So, the accord needs the alliance. It doesn't, as far as I can tell, actually need us to be in love. It needs trade corridors and mineral rights, and 70 years of not lobbing artillery at each other across a border neither side particularly wants to fight over anymore. That's all true, Dalen said carefully, though I'm fairly sure the document itself specifies marriage, not merely alliance. Documents, Selythe said, can be renegotiated. I happen to have spent the last several months in the company of an engineer who's taught me that almost everything broken can be repaired into something different than it was originally built to be, provided you're honest about what's actually failing. She leaned forward. What if the unification didn't require either of our hearts as collateral? A formal alliance, full diplomatic and economic union, every clause that actually matters to either of our governments, without the wedding attached to it like an afterthought nobody bothered to question. It took the better part of 2 weeks of furious diplomatic correspondence, several alarmed advisors on both sides, and one memorable afternoon where Selythe's mother sat very still for a long moment before saying, "You want to do what asterisk to the accord?" in a tone that suggested she was recalculating her entire understanding of her daughter. But it held. The mineral rights held. The trade corridors held. The 70 years of uneasy peace, it turned out, had never actually required two people to stand in the hall of standing light and pretend at a devotion neither of them possessed. It had only required two governments willing to say so out loud, once someone was finally brave enough to ask the question. Ethan, when she told him, sat very still on her window seat for a long moment before he said, "So you're telling me I helped negotiate an interplanetary diplomatic accord from the floor with a multi-tool in my hand?" "You helped me realize I was allowed to ask the question," Selythe said. "The negotiating I did myself, thank you, with considerably less complaining about the prose." "I don't complain about prose. I complain about translated maintenance manuals. There's a difference." He was smiling, but there was something more careful underneath it, and she recognized, after months of learning to read him, that he was working up to a real question. "What happens now, to us, I mean? I'm still an engineer on a trade visa. The accord didn't change that part." "No," Selythe agreed. "It didn't. I'm still a princess of a house that just spent 2 weeks renegotiating a treaty from scratch, and I imagine that comes with its own complications neither of us has fully worked out yet. I'm not going to pretend this is simple, Ethan. I think you fixed something in me that needed fixing, and I think what comes after that is going to require both of us actually showing up for the parts that are harder than a broken coolant array." "I'm good at showing up," Ethan said. "Slightly worse at door frames, but I'm working on it." "I noticed," Selythe said, and when he reached over and took her hand carefully, the same careful way he handled everything that mattered to him, she let him, in a room that no longer needed fixing nearly as badly as it had 3 months before, with a future ahead of her that she had, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually chosen for herself.